I've kind of went through this lesson. I did it, I guess it was the first part back several months ago. Then last month we picked up part 2, and now it's part 3. I'm just going to finish it up with this, and we'll look at Joseph's life from where we'll pick it up from, and to the end of Genesis, and that'll be the end of the next time I teach. I'll teach on something else. But to kind of go over the recap, and I won't beat it to death because you all know the story well, but we have the story of Joseph. He is the son of Jacob, which his grandfather's great-grandfather was Abraham and Isaac, and now Jacob, also known as Israel. And we have Joseph, his son by Rachel. Rachel was his dad's basically first choice for a wife, but her dad Laban, he agreed to work for him for 7 years, but Laban tricked him, had him marry Leah, which is Rachel's older sister. So then he works for Laban an additional 7 years and marries Rachel. So there are a total of 12 sons through 4 women, 2 of them sisters, one of their each handmaidens also born children. So there's a total of 12. In the Batten order, Joseph is number 11 of 12, Benjamin being the youngest, also by Rachel, because if you recall, Rachel had trouble conceiving. She finally did, but there were a whole lot of other kids in the process. So finally she did. They were Jacob's children from his older age, so he took great delight in them. And what appears to be that Joseph was his favorite. As we see, Joseph has this gift of divination or dreams, where he's able to dream things and see things, and one of the dreams that he tells his brothers about is how basically they'll be subjects of his and under his command, which I don't think any of them really appreciated or wanted to hear, to the point that it probably got annoying. It reminds me of a description one of my good friends told me about his son-in-law, and it's not a compliment, but he said, well, he has the trouble a lot of young men have, absolute certainty coupled with a complete lack of knowledge. And I was like, ouch. But with that, Joseph is very certain that that's going to happen, but he's probably a little arrogant about it. So his brothers take him, I think, probably to take him down a peg or two and throw him in the hole. Later that day, sell him into bondage to the Ishmaelites, and he's taken to Egypt. So he goes from a life of privilege and dad's favorite to bondage, and then from bondage he does well while he works for Potiphar. Potiphar is very fond of him. Everything under his hand continues to improve, continues to show results, positive results. However, he's a very young man. He's a slave, so he's probably in fairly good shape. The Bible tells us that he is a handsome man, so he is a young, handsome guy that's probably somewhat buff, and Potiphar's wife, Zuleika, most likely the trophy wife, has eyes for him. So she continually, or at least several times, tries to talk him into having an affair with him, and Joseph won't do it. So finally, she tries, and he runs away, but she grabs his cloak, and she uses that as leverage to say that Joseph tried to sexually assault her, at which point, realistically, I think if Potiphar believed it, he could have put him to death. I mean, there's still crime of passion law in many states in America in the 21st century. I can imagine what it was like in Egypt, 4,000 years ago or longer. But he wasn't. He was put in prison. He wasn't put to death. And so while he's in prison, because life kind of goes steadily downhill from bondage, where he does well, to prison, but he does well there too. He's in prison. Again, he's put in a position of administration. Everything, again, goes well for him. The guards love him. He's trusted with a whole lot. But while he's there, Pharaoh throws his baker and cupbearer or butler into prison, and then they have these dreams, and Joseph, through the divination gift, is able to tell them what it'll be. The baker is hung from a tree, the butler is put back in his position, and if you remember, Jacob says, basically, don't forget me when you're gone, when you go back to Pharaoh. Remember, 2 years goes by, not a word is spoken, so Joseph sits in prison for 2 more years, and then finally Pharaoh has the dream, and it's the kine in the ears of corn, And it's there's 7 good years, if you remember, of plenty, and then 7 years of famine. They bring the butler remembers Joseph, then brings him out of prison. He gets an audience with Pharaoh and tells Pharaoh everything that's going to happen. And one of the things I thought was interesting, I had a first sergeant one time tell me, it's okay if you complain, but if you bring me a problem, also try to bring me a solution. So that way, I know how to fix it, or, sometimes people have better ideas, especially if they're the ones doing it. So he gives Pharaoh not only the interpretation to his dream, but he gives him a solution. What you need to do, and I'll paraphrase again, is put a man in charge of this that will oversee the grain, will store it up for 7 years, and we'll have an excess. And so that way when the famine comes, the people won't starve and we'll have an excess built up. So Pharaoh says, hey, that's a good idea. How about you? And next thing you know, literally in probably a day or 2 days' time, Joseph goes from prison to the number 2 in all of Egypt. And if you remember, Pharaoh gives him a necklace of gold and a signet ring so he can essentially sign official documents on Pharaoh's behalf. If they're back through the monarchies of the history of the world, the signet ring is one of those things that they put wax on, drop your ring on it, and so it's official. It's an official seal. Well, he gives that to Joseph very early on. So essentially, Joseph has all the powers of Pharaoh in Egypt, and he's second only to Pharaoh. So that's where we pick it up. Joseph is now the prime minister is what they call him, but he's the number 2 in command of all of Egypt. He has a wife, an Egyptian wife, children. He's arrived, and then the famine hits. And so when the famine hits, it's not just Egypt, because Egypt has the Nile that comes through. It's a very fertile region, but not too far east of there. So I look at a map. Israel's not far away, and so, or Canaan then. So Jacob, aka Israel, sends his remaining sons, all but Benjamin, to go to Egypt because he hears they have grain there, which indeed they do. They have food, they have those things that they can go trade for, so they don't starve. So then we come to today's chapter at 44, where Joseph is now in charge and his brothers come into Egypt, but they don't recognize him. Joseph recognizes them, they don't recognize him. Look at my notes here. So Joseph deals harshly with them, and they can't figure out why, because again, they don't know that it's their brother, but he does recognize them. And so he accuses them of being spies, and then they leave, because they tell him the story of, we're one of 12 sons, one's dead, one's back home with dad. And so he says, well, I think you're a spy, and to prove you're not a spy, go get your other brother and bring him, and then I'll believe you. So they do, and they go, and he has their money put in from the grain that they bought. Well, they brought it back, and they brought Benjamin back. So, hey, we're not spies. Oh, by the way, here's the money that somebody put back in our bags. We didn't steal from you. So they actually dealt with him above board. So then he comes back, and this is where we pick up chapter 44. And Judy, if you would read 1 through 5. Does anybody want to take 6 through 13? Betty. Okay, Judy, if you would please kick us off.
Then he commanded the steward of his house, fill the men's sack with food as much as they could carry, and put each man's money in the mouth of his sack, and put my cup, the silver cup, in the mouth of the sack of the youngest, with his money for the grain, as he did as Joseph told him. As soon as the morning was light, the men were sent away with their donkeys. They had gone only a short distance from the city. Now Joseph said to his steward, up, follow after the men, and when you overtake them, say to them, why have you repaid evil for good? Is it not from this that my Lord drinks, and by this that he practices divination? You have done evil in doing this.
So he overtook them and spoke these words to them. They said to him, why does my Lord speak such words as these? For be it from your servants to do such a thing. Behold, the money which we found in the mouth of our sacks we have brought back to you from the land of Canaan. How then would we steal silver or gold from your Lord's house? With whomever of your servants it is found, let him die, and we also will be my Lord's slaves. So he said, now let it also be according to your words. He with whom it found shall be my slave, and the rest of you shall be innocent. Then they hurried, each man lowered his sack to the ground, and each man opened his sack. He searched, beginning with the oldest and ending with the youngest, and the cup was found in Benjamin's sack. Then they tore their clothes, and when each man loaded his donkey, they returned to the city.
Alrighty, so basically Joseph has the brothers framed, but it's a ruse. He puts his cup, which I imagine to be kind of like a chalice, an official, one of those things that kings and people of power drink out of back in ancient Egypt. And it's his, obviously, there's some sort of marking on it, I'm sure. And so he has one of his workers put it in Benjamin's sack of grain. And Benjamin was chosen intentionally. He didn't just helter-skelter put it in. He told them to put it in there. Yet when they're overtaken and they find it in Benjamin's sack, what I find to be kind of the most telling is in verse 13, it says, then they tore their clothes and every man loaded his donkey and they returned to the city. They didn't have to. Essentially, the only one that had to go back was Benjamin. They all chose to, but Benjamin was the one that was basically on the hook, for lack of a better term, for the larceny. And so when we get to chapter 14, it says, when Judah and his brothers came to Joseph's house, he was still there. They fell down before him to the ground. Joseph said to them, what deed is this that you have done? Do you not know that a man like me can indeed practice divination? Judah said, what shall we say to my Lord? What shall we speak? Or how can we clear ourselves? God has found out the guilt of your servants. Behold, we are my Lord's servants, both we and he also, in whose hand the cup was found. But he said, far be it from me that I should do so. Only the man in whose hand the cup was found shall be my servant. But as for you, go up in peace to your father. So Joseph is now going to take Benjamin and make him his slave. The rest of you guys can go. He's the only guilty one. I'm not going to punish all of you, just the one that actually stole from me. But what is now interesting, and I won't read the rest of the chapter, I'll just kind of go through it, is Judah steps in and says, you can't. Take me instead, and here's why. I basically told my dad, now, and then he gives him the whole story, which of course Joseph knows well because it's his story, but I told my dad about the way you dealt with us before, and I told him about our brother, and he wouldn't believe us and sell us unless we brought our brother back. Well, I brought my brother back, but my brother this younger brother Benjamin is the only remaining from my father's essentially favorite wife. The other brother's dead. He's the only one, and I had to promise him that I would bring him back, and if I don't, my dad's going to die. It's just going to break his heart. And if you read what Jacob says, it says, if you take this one also from me and harm happens to him, you will bring down my gray hairs and evil to Sheol, which is death or the grave in Hebrew. So Judah steps in and says, please take me. Don't let this happen. Don't want my dad, if I want it to happen to my brother, but I also don't want it to happen to my dad. And I kind of, that strikes a chord with me. I had a former supervisor one time. He was a little older than me, and bear with me if some of you guys are in this range now, but he said, when your parents get to be in their 70s, you view things much differently then. And I kind of was like, my dad was in probably his 60s then. I was like, okay. But now that he's in his 70s, and my mom, you view them differently. It's like, okay, now, when you're kids, like, well, they're going to live forever. They're my parents, all that. Well, when they get older, especially once they hit the magic 70, things change. I have to look out for them more than I did before. They're still adults. They can still take care of themselves. But you worry a little more about their welfare and being, because they're now starting to get a little older. And what I see in this is that Judah does the same thing. He's now concerned. The change in the brothers' attitude from when they sold Joseph to now all of a sudden, all of them are willing to sacrifice is pretty telling. And I think that it's twofold. One is that that's God inspired, and two, there's a genuine love that maybe their heart has changed. Judah really steps up to try to save what's left of his family at that point, and I think that's big, because when you look at it, when we go into, let me find it real quick. At the beginning of chapter 45, it says, "Then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him. He cried, 'Make everyone go out from me.' So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud so that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, 'I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?' But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at the presence." So he finally breaks down, because I think it definitely melted his heart as well, because he had a definite reason to be angry and to hold a grudge, because they sold him into slavery 20 years ago. And now they've come back, and while he, I think, still had some anger, the change in their attitude now, I think, really touched him, and he made everyone go, and then he told them who he was. I think that's a very powerful moment, and it's powerful for him, but it's also a good lesson for us to learn. I think Joseph has the tears and the love are very genuine at that point, and that's one of the main moments. We'll get to some of the lessons of it later, but I think that's one of the main takeaways from the story of Joseph, is that he forgave. He was in a position of absolute power and authority, and he was in a position to where he could definitely take revenge and just pour out his wrath on those that have done him pretty wrong overall. I don't know much worse than having your family sell you into slavery, and yet he forgave them at that moment. And not only did he forgive them, but he goes a step farther. It's not just, okay, what you did was bad, and it's okay, I forgive you. It's a total reconciliation, not just an apology and a forgiveness, but there's a coming together of the family that had been missing for some time, that you can tell. Because he also says that sorry, 1 minute, my notes. So once he reveals himself, he asks about his dad, who is still alive, and then sends for him, and he sends all of horses and wagons and all that to go back and get his dad and to bring him so they can have a reunion. And if you look, not only does he forgive and share that wealth, but he also covers himself with Pharaoh at that moment. In Genesis 45:16, it says, "When the report was heard in Pharaoh's house, Joseph's brothers have come. It pleased Pharaoh and his servants, and Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'Say to your brothers, do this, load your beasts and go back to the land of Canaan, and take your father and your households and come to me, and I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you shall eat out of the fat of the land. And you, Joseph, are commanded to say, do this, take wagons from the land of Egypt for your little ones and for your wives, and bring your father and come. Have no concern for your goods, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours.'" So I think that signifies also Joseph's position in Pharaoh's eyes, because now Joseph has done just as he was favored by his dad, just as he was favored by Potiphar, just as he was favored in prison, he is now favored by Pharaoh. And so Pharaoh, who is pleased with everything that Joseph done, had just gave him a blank check and goes, "Go get your family. This is a personal issue. You go handle it, and then bring your dad back here," essentially to create the reunion, which he does. And without getting too far into the rest of the next couple of chapters in Genesis, are how Jacob loads up, comes to Egypt, sees Joseph for the first time in 20 some odd years. And then Jacob / Israel meets Pharaoh blesses him, goes into court, tells him basically that they are shepherds. And as most of you know, and for Egyptians, that's kind of a bad thing. While they may enjoy the livestock, they don't like shepherds, and so they keep them in the land of Goshen, which is outside of town. And then the Hebrews become, for lack of a better term, Pharaoh's official shepherds. So they settle in Goshen, and they prosper. Now, Joseph does well. The rest of the Hebrews do well, which is for the main reason Joseph was placed there to begin with. It was so that Abraham's line that God promised will be taken care of. And so all of Israel packs up and moves to Egypt. As you guys know, the Exodus comes later, but they do well. They prosper in Egypt. All of them. They have generations are born. They do well financially. Joseph continues to do well financially. And so the entire children of Israel, if you will, prosper and do very, very well, which is what leads to them going into bondage to start out with. So we're getting a little too far ahead there. So when Israel dies, or Jacob, he's taken, he wants to be buried back home in Canaan, next to his family. He doesn't want to be buried in Egypt, and so he asks Joseph to do that, and Joseph promises them that he will take him back to Canaan and bury him, and he does so. It says that Egypt mourned, and but when it happens, if you look at verse 49 and 19, Israel dies, and his brothers all of a sudden become fearful because they're kind of, and if you remember in the movie The Godfather, as long as the mother was alive, Michael would not go after Fredo, his brother. But once the mother dies, Fredo ends up getting murdered. And so the brothers are scared now that, well, now that Dad's gone, maybe he'll want to get revenge now. Maybe it was all an act. But so they, hang on, I missed it's 40, my notes aren't matching up. One moment. Okay. But anyhow, so I wrote it down this afternoon, and now I don't remember where it is. But anyhow, so they were afraid that that Joseph would put them to death now that their dad has gone, but he doesn't. He says, no, forget about that. Those are from times past, and I'm not. He basically tells them, God placed me here, and I'm not in the place of God. So relax, nothing's going to happen to you. And he continues, it says, to provide for his family.
That's in
50 and 19. I had it as 48 and 19. I miswrote it down. It says, but Joseph said to them, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. So he not only forgives them, he reassures them that, first of all, this was God's plan. And second of all, I will continue to provide for you out of the best of the land of Egypt. So with that, it says, so Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years, and Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation, the children of, it goes through the name of his grandchildren. But so Joseph lived to be 110 and saw his great-grandchildren. Then they embalmed him, and he was put into a tomb in Egypt, or coffin in Egypt, it says. So that's basically Joseph's life. He maintains that forgiveness and that spirit throughout the entire ordeal with the being reunited or reunion with his family and his brothers, when he pretty much had every believable excuse to bring vengeance upon him, but he chose not to. If you look at chapter 50, or excuse me, verse 1, I'll get it right in a minute. Chapter 1 of Exodus, 22 through 20. I'll get this right in a minute. Exodus 1, 8 through 12, it says, "Now there rose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore they set up taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and the more they spread abroad, and the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel." So God continues to bless them. But the trouble comes in is that the new Pharaoh, new king that came up, did not know Joseph, wasn't aware of the unique relationship that the old Pharaoh had had with him. And so they start to look at the Hebrews now, because they have multiplied, because they're prosperous, as they look at them as enemies now, whereas before it was almost like a partnership. And that's when we get into Exodus, and of course Moses leads them out after several hundred years. I believe it's about 400. But anyhow, so to kind of look at the full story, the lessons from Joseph, and this is some of the things I wrote down and looked at in my research, and if you guys, something jumps into your head, by all means, please chime in. The one thing that I took away is we all have a purpose from God, and nothing stops his plan. For whatever it is that he wants us to do, we're here for his purpose. The word tells us that we're called according to his purpose, and Joseph was. And regardless of all the turmoil and negative things that happened as far as bondage and prison and all that, Joseph still maintained his focus on God and his purpose. And that's kind of one of the big takeaways from that. Does anybody have anything they want to add? Mike?
I just want to say, back in these days, when Jesus hadn't came,
Right.
the covenant hadn't been formed, and they was, I'm going to say, was still in darkness because of the lack of full understanding of God and what God's purpose was for them. We, in our lives today, should be willing to do more for Christ than what they was ever expected to, because we know what we have. We are bought and paid for. Christ bought took our sins, but he bought us when he died on that cross and shed the blood for our sins.
Mm-hmm.
And we should be willing to serve him more than what these guys here in the Old Testament was expected. God looked for them to serve him. He gave them opportunities after opportunities, and they failed all together. But we know better, because we have the New Testament. We know what Christ has done for us, and it's our jobs as a servant of his, for what he did for us, to do the work that he is requiring of us to do for him. And that's the problem with our world today. People are not willing to do the will of God. Even when they see that there's something they should be doing, they're still hesitant to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we really fail, because we know better.
That we do.
We know that we should be doing the right things, and we have no excuses, because we have this word right here, and God's word tells us exactly what we should do and how we should be doing it. But we fail in doing it, all of us, every day.
Absolutely. Yeah, and they didn't have, as you pointed out, they didn't have the Bible like we do, where all these examples and all. They were kind of living it as it happened, and
Back here before, when they went into bondage, they didn't have the prophets. Joseph had visions, still Isaiah, you know, and all these other prophets that came after, you know, that foretold a lot of things that was coming. But at this time, they didn't have all these prophets.
Nope.
You know, Joseph was basically the only one at the time that was seeing visions and could foresee and talk about things when he had dreams. And he was only able to interpret the dreams that, you know, was told to him. And then he went to God to get the answers because it was God that provided him with the insights to what the Pharaoh's dream was in the first place.
I find it very interesting that when Joseph was really young and he had the dreams and he didn't handle it well, then he himself never got to have any dreams again. He was able to interpret other people's dreams,
But they weren't his.
but they weren't his anymore because he didn't handle it well to start with. And I sometimes think, you know, sometimes we don't handle things well. And
For me, most times, but yeah.
maybe that's a lesson that when, you know, when God blesses us, we need to handle it well.
Exactly. I mean, that's also one of the things that I was going to bring up later down at the bottom is that the trusting and in the faithfulness that he had. He continued to trust in God, and I think that's like we were talking about the issue with the young man. He did not handle it well, but he later learned to handle all those things as far as the prominence and being number 2 in Egypt. He did show some humility there that he did not have earlier. So I thought that was also a good point. One of the other things I saw in here is maintain your integrity. He very much could have stolen from Potiphar. He was pretty much turned over to him. He could have committed adultery with Potiphar's wife. He could have stolen from Pharaoh. He could have made himself up, like you're talking about with this humility. He could have built himself up, maybe even gave Pharaoh a run for his money for the actual throne, but he didn't. He maintained his integrity throughout. And even when his brothers came, again, while he dealt harshly with them, he did see a change in them, and he took care of them, as we were talking at the end. Even after his dad died, he was like, I will continue to provide for you and your family. So throughout all of that, he maintained integrity and humility. And there was some, I was kind of thinking about when I was putting together the lesson, like single words and single phrases that I come to my mind when I think of Joseph. And the first one was faithfulness. He was faithful throughout, even though he was in the bondage, even though he was a slave and in prison, he still maintained his faith and belief in God. And with that integrity, did everything he could, the best he could, in bad situations. And so the integrity and the faithfulness came to mind, and as well as patience. Sitting in prison, waiting on the butler to call for him and remember him, you know, and there was a whole lot through there up to that point. He still maintained his patience, his faithfulness, and his belief in God, and he continued to trust in God throughout the entire story. The other one that the last two that kind of stuck with me the most were forgiveness. He got dealt some pretty bad cards by members of his family that he loved the most and thought loved him the most. And when he had his moment for revenge, when everything was set up just, you know, for him to just drop the hammer, and had, I won't say he had an excuse to, but he had a reason, he didn't. He forgave them, and even later, after his dad died, he continued to take care of them, continued that forgiveness, and not just forgiveness like, okay, I forgive you, now go away from me and never talk to me again, but true reconciliation and true forgiveness from the heart. And so that's what strikes me with that. Those were kind of the major points and the major phrases that I took away from the story. Mike?
I want to sort of characterize it, put it in a little aspect in this way. Judy was talking about how he didn't handle his dream well. But then when he had another dream, and he told his dad about it and stuff too, and his father even said, "Are we all supposed to, bow to you?"
Like even me.
That was God giving him that dream, showing him what he had in his future plan for him. Joseph didn't have a person that could come to him and tell him what his dream actually how it was going to lay out for him.
Mhm.
God laid it out, and that dream that he had played out throughout every step up until he was underneath the Pharaoh as the number 2. Joseph was led by God. That's why he was always faithful, because he knew in the beginning that dream, but he didn't know how to go about doing anything about it at the time, because as we know, he was young.
Mhm.
So when his brothers throwed him in the well or whatever it
The
was,
pit,
that
yeah.
was dry, that was the start. God was with him from that time on, because they originally wanted to kill him altogether,
Mhm.
but the oldest one said, no,
Yeah, Reuben.
do this, but we'll sell him into slavery. And then God was with him through every part and every moment of his life, because like you said, when he was accused of being with the Pharaoh,
Potiphar.
Potter's, I was trying to think of the thing. Why? Well, Potter could have said, no, take him out and behead him.
He could
God
have.
placed on his heart, no, we'll just imprison him, put him in prison, because of all the good things that he had actually done for him, and he knew that he was doing good things, and he also knew how his life was.
I think so too.
So as the story kept going on, everything just worked out to what his dream was originally all about, and his life was guided by God, because it was God's plan in the very beginning. We can't change what God has for us. We can turn from some of the things that he wants us to do and not do them, because we do that all the time. We hear him say,
Yeah.
do this, but then we turn around and we do the exact opposite. But God's got a plan, and in the end, his plan's always going to come true. It's always going to work out for his will, not ours. And that's what happened in Joseph's life.
But Joseph had a lot to learn.
Yes.
That's why he had to go through so many things, because, he would not be able to have done what he did at the end if he hadn't learned all these different lessons that God was teaching him. He doesn't always cause bad things, but a lot of times he will use them, bad things in our life, to bring about good.
Absolutely. And then you never want to learn those lessons that way, but sometimes there's no other way. Exactly.
We don't learn by being good all the time. We got to fall sometimes for the better.
Yeah,
That's how we do learn.
That's our human nature.
That's right.
it is. A couple of the final takeaways I got from that is one that, like you guys were talking, it says God knows when you're ready to do his work. And early on, Joseph wasn't ready. He gave him the vision, okay, here's what's going to happen, but he didn't handle it well. But he knew after he'd taken him down multiple pegs that, once he had spent that time in prison, okay, now you're ready. And he brought him out. And then after he had been elevated, like, okay, now it's been a good amount of time and you see what life can be. And then he reintroduces the brothers to him, and the forgiveness takes over that he, I'm sure, would not have executed or been so quick to forgive as a younger person. But as he kind of went through those things and those hardships, he was elevated, he was ready to serve then. Exactly. And then the final takeaway that I took away, that I had for that, is that when elevated, practice humility and forgiveness. Remember, the gifts are from God. It's very easy once you kind of reach a certain point, like, well, look what I did. Now I'm in this position, and it was all this hard work and study and toil, and yeah, you had part in it, but at the end, it's really God that put you there. And those gifts that you have are from God. They're not really yours. And so to get into it, if you guys remember, Elvis did the song as well as Johnny Cash about you can run on for a long time. You can run on for a long time, but eventually, if God has work for you to do, you're either going to be brought to heel and do it, or be dead, one or the other. But you're not going to have much choice in it. So He has a plan for all of us. Getting back to the original point, and so there's a purpose for all of us, and the key is to listen to Him and to pray about it and to find it and then to execute it. And with that, that's all I have on this lesson on Joseph. It was all 3 parts. Thank you very much for being here and your input, and apologies for kind of the disjointed nature that it came together, but I started looking at it and then wanted to put it together, and I knew I wouldn't be able to do it in one Bible study, and I thought, well, maybe 2, and it's going to have to be 3. So finally we got through the 3rd one, and that's basically all I have. Does anybody have anything else they want to add? All righty. Well, with that, I'll say a prayer, and then we'll dismiss a few minutes early. Lord, thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for this day. Excuse me. Thank you for this day and the ability to come to your house and to study your word. And Lord, as we leave here, please allow us to hear your voice and to be patient as you always are, and to know that you have a purpose for us, and that purpose is what we're really here for, and to bear in mind that the gifts that we have truly come from you, and they are to be for your purpose and for those things that you'll have us to do on this earth. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.